I suppose the question is about why don't people appreciate youth work? Um, why is it that we don't get the respect that we seem to expect from what we do, our opinion of what we do? Um, why is that not shared more broadly, government in policy, public in the media? Um, it seems in the main that youth work is taken as a sort of social welfare response to the world, to young people. In the popular magazines, literature, media. Um, it's tried to stay close to a sort of differentiated teaching and learning model, and open, like the open classroom. That's where the ideas in the first place back in the 60s came from. Those kind of liberal education ideas, different forms of learning, stimulating different forms of learning. That's all got lost in the kind of, as I say, this kind of, or all got lost, a lot of it's got lost in this kind of welfare model, that somehow we're there to do some social work, to do some to fill in some gaps in therapeutical work, all of which we have no training or background in, most of us anyway. It's hard to start to point the finger at people and say, you're to blame for it, you're to blame for it. The government don't give us enough money. And that's a popular misunderstanding. The government has never directly funded youth work. Always come through local authorities. Government doesn't give a certain amount of money to youth work. So I don't see how the government can cut youth work directly, or how it cuts youth work off as a profession. We can keep saying it, but it's not true. It doesn't bear any relation to policy or to the way government works alongside youth work. In fact, in the last 20 years, far more money has been put into youth work than into young people, through apprenticeships and that kind of thing, training, not the stuff that we want, NCS, etc., far more than the previous 20 years. So this idea that somehow directly the youth work has been cut, to the young people's finance towards young people has been cut. That isn't true either. What is true is that there has been a cutback in things like youth clubs and what we would recognise as youth work provision, and that's through local authority cuts. One of the reasons that happens, as one council leader said to me quite a while back now, is, I don't want to cut youth work, Brian, but it's the only thing that I can legally cut, that I have any leeway with, because youth work isn't a legal statutory service, unlike the roads and the policing and social services and all those kinds of things, which has to be housing, has to be covered by local authorities. So that lack of understanding of policy amongst us as youth workers, it seems to be common. A lack of understanding of even the Constitution, the way government works, the relationship between government departments and local authorities. So it's a broad constitutional misunderstanding or ignorance of youth work, of policy relating to youth work, and the whole idea of rights of young people. If you look at the idea, for instance, as I've said many times and bored many people with it, the idea of informal education flies in the face of a great deal of the rights of the child in terms of knowing what education they're getting, why, and what it's supposed to do. Openly, that should be told to them. And likewise, parents have a right to withdraw their children from sex education, from religious education, and how much of that comes into what we do in youth work without even any consideration of parents is a moot point. But all of this, I'm not blaming youth workers for this. What I do think there's there is something answerable from trainers, universities, training agencies, and independent trainers. That there is a derisible account of law, policy, constitutional matters within youth work education. Usually, when you mention direct policy that relates to youth workers or childcare, most people in the academic sphere who are teaching youth work have no idea what you're talking about. They have no idea of things about the likes of Monroe and supervision. So, time and again, and this is across the universities particularly, that people say to me that, you know, at least a third of what they learn is irrelevant. It's not useful to them, or it's repetitious. As I know, I've been an external examiner with several universities, but also dealt with youth workers from many origins in terms of their academic and educational training. And again, this comes back. You know, a lot of it's a waste of time, a lot of it's reiteration. And all these areas, as I say, of policy and law, are practically ignored. So youth workers are sent out into the field after training with not much clue of a lot of the ideas and the origins of even funding, where it comes from. And again, we kind of think that youth work is a right. Well, it isn't. It just isn't. I mean, yes, the argument that what is a society that doesn't tend to the transition from youth to adult, what kind of society decides it's not going to do that? That's again, you know, how would you describe that? How would you say, well, we are not going to do that? We're consciously not going to do it. But that still doesn't alter the fact that youth work isn't a right. Most youth work isn't delivered by statutory services. Never has been. Vastly, it has been something that's conducted by voluntary agencies and often by volunteers. Some more or less trained than others, some not trained at all. That's the tradition since the 50s, the 60s and the 70s. 80–90% of youth workers are voluntary basis. It's not paid for and people are not professionally qualified. The whole idea that youth workers are professionally qualified, what they get is a professional qualification. That's again a very sketchy area. You know, professionalism requires some sort of assessment of ongoing assessment of practice. It does in law, it does in medicine. That's why these are called professions. It's not necessarily the case in youth work. These professional qualifications, placements are often very, very thin. The placement elements are thin. And what is particularly scandalously, I would say, covered is supervision. You know, and again, some of you may have heard me preaching about Monroe, and now that in the childcare sphere, that is seen as something that we should be doing, supervision, not appraisal, not therapy, not forms of counselling or mentoring. Those are not specifically mentioned to any extent. But what is mentioned to some extent, to quite an extent, enough for me to write a book about it, is supervision within this big childcare review, biggest, you know, that's ever been done, and nothing's been done bigger anywhere since, you know, more extensive than Monroe's review of child protection, and supervision being an element, you know, a considerable element of that. Very few youth workers do it, and quite a few openly avoid it. But without this skill in thinking about what I'm doing and how I'm doing it, you cannot be regarded as professional. You cannot raise the flag of professionality, and we can't expect to be regarded in that way, because we have, as a group, areas of vast ignorance around law, around policy, around constitution, and around thinking about our practice, critically reviewing our practice. All those things would be part of professional training. Broadly speaking, doing youth work, they're not, or to a very, very small, relatively insignificant effect. Most of the books on youth work that are used, the texts are how-to manuals. They're not academic or theoretical with any kind of weight that is convincing. They're certainly not critical. What you see published in the last 10 years is very similar to what was published in the last 30 years before that. So it's repetitious, it's a credo, a kind of biblical reading of youth work. Now all of this sums up, are we an organised group? Do we all pay into a common union or association? Yes, there's the NYA, but the NYA is really a quango. It doesn't represent anybody, it's not voted for. It is at best it's as a regional remit. And it doesn't represent the interests of youth workers, it represents the interest of itself. And because now the government is one of its paymasters, it represents the government. Again, the whole idea of professionality is it's somehow independent of the state. It tries to be independent, even critical of the state. The lawyers and barristers exist to build the law, to create the law, abide by it, but also add to it, argue about it and develop it, for instance. Same with medicine. Doctors, nurses, researchers in medicine change the credo of medicine and the principles by which it's conducted as they change over time. They're not set in stone by 2 or 3 academics. Banks and Circum come to mind, which have dominated our ideas of ethical dialogue. Just 2 people. They're not voted for. This has not been run through professional committees because there are none. They don't exist. Yeah, and I know that there's been efforts like the Institute of Youth Work, but again, they're not representative and they're not very informed. Not their fault, nobody's fault. This is not pointing a finger at anybody. I'm reflecting on the situation, really. So that's where we stand, and where it leaves us, all of that together leaves us seemingly unable to organise ourselves as a group, or even to say what it is we do as a group. The endless conferences asking what is youth work over the years, which is an admission to the world that we don't know what we're doing after all these years. From the 1960s, that's when youth work really began. We have not really agreed or established what we do. So if you don't know what you do, you can't really agree on what you do, you don't know how to do it. So we literally say to the world, we don't know what we're doing, we don't know how, and therefore we don't know how to do it. But then we want to appreciate him for it. That's a difficult one. That's a difficult one to sell straightforwardly. So that's my little thoughts on that. There's a lot to it. I mean, there's a lot going on under the waves with all of that. And I do want to reiterate, I'm not blaming anyone. But the situation creates a disorganised, largely dysfunctional group of workers, because it doesn't constitute a profession as such, that cannot approach major policy, it cannot approach government in any kind of coordinated or joined up fashion. It doesn't do that. You get splinter groups that fall off and have minimal effect, unlike, for argument's sake, nurses and social workers, who are brought together in pretty solid, relatively to us, professional organisation, professional associations and unions. None of that, and we put our flag up about organising young people, participation, etc. And yet it's very difficult to organise ourselves and to get participation. I think I'm at the moment supervising something like 50 people over a very big geographical space. But I'm organised. I'm called to do that, because other people are either not prepared or not able to do it. And that says an awful lot about us, just that little local snap, about our capabilities and our willingness to review our practice and to work with each other to do that. Anyway, upwards and onwards.